Um, if you're on this call, you probably know we're Athena. We're a company that builds all kinds of things like compliance training. Specifically for today, we're going to be talking about our anonymous reporting platform. And our entire mission and values really align around building inclusive and ethical workplaces. So we're really excited to talk a little bit about that and how anonymous reporting plays into that today. Really excited for you all to be on this call. Last time I did one of these, I completely forgot to introduce my co-hosts. So I'm going to pause and take a minute before we talk about the rest of this session to introduce my lovely fellow co-hosts, Ann Solmson, our co-founder and CTO, and Brandis Anderson, our badass general counsel. And out of anxiety, I'm just going to throw this out there. Heads up, everyone. We love having Brandis on the call for her legal savvy, but in no way should anything that we are saying on this call be taken as legal advice. It is the legal perspective that Brandis will be sharing with us all today. So thank you very much, Brandis. I hope you appreciate that. All right, so if you all are on this call today, I'm going to guess it's because you are so stoked about anonymous reporting, as you should be. But for anyone who's here maybe thinking, I'm not really sure what I should know about anonymous reporting, this is more exploratory for me and I'd just like to learn more, we've got you covered as well. For anyone who's been on any webinars with me, I like to make these a little bit interactive because I think it can be dry and a little bit hard to stay focused if it's just a one-way lecture the entire time. So I'm going to kick it off with a pulse check to sort of introduce the topic, and then we'll talk a little bit more about why we focused on this topic today and why it's so important. So everyone be prepared, get your keyboards out, open up that chat box. And if you don't respond, just know that I'm going to sit here awkwardly waiting for a response and then awkwardly answering my own questions. So if you'd like to save us all the awkward silence, go ahead and get those keyboards ready. My question for you all is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with the following statement? 5 being I super agree, 1 being not at all. The statement is, I'm able to easily persuade my leadership team to take action based on anecdotal evidence, such as HRBP discussions. I'll wait awkwardly.
Melanie, you were not kidding. It is awkward to wait.
I know, but you know what? I actually see, oh, I didn't see it. Oh, okay, let me ask the question again for anyone who didn't hear. Thank you, Melissa. I'm banking on you to answer, Melissa. The question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, this is how much do you agree with the following statement? I'm able to easily persuade my leadership team to take action based on anecdotal evidence only, such as, things that I'm picking up in an HRBP discussion. And for anyone who struggles to follow along in verbally, I'm also pasting the question into the chat box. And yes, answer in the chat. Perfect. Thank you all. Clearly, I need to work on my instructions. That's on me. And I'm going to answer while answers come in. Thank you. I can see a couple already. I'm going to answer Anne. I remember once actually sitting in on this. It was a training. I think it might have been a paradigm training. It was a live session. And they said that there are different learning types and personality types. And the introverts in particular tend to need 7 full seconds to respond. Because they're thinking or they're waiting for someone else to answer first. And so 7 seconds is approximately how much you should wait of awkward silence before moving on. I know, and it's hard, those 7 seconds, but I do it, and sure enough, a couple of people typically give a response. Okay, so it looks like 2 3s on this, which is very interesting to me. Lori, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to have Amanda, who's working behind the scenes here. She's going to give you access to unmute yourself. Could you tell me a little bit more about your answer? Why did you answer 3 to this question? I'm able to persuade my leadership team to take action, based solely on anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, sure. Hi, guys. So I would say it's a 3. My team trusts me. I have a lot of insight, and I'm pretty close to the ground on things I hear across the org. But typically, to persuade them to take action, I need data behind it. If I don't have the data, we always have to err on the side of is this just a voice of one or is this a voice of many? So without data, it's hard to really take action on those type of things.
I think, okay, what an astute observation. You're right. Data is always the important thing that leadership is waiting on. Our CEO, Roxanne, she always really emphasizes this, which is great. It's really helped me to make sure I'm always bringing numbers with anything that I'm doing. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question to that, which is, how do you provide data then, or data, in what form do you provide this? If you have an anecdotal finding and you want to make sure that you're making a compelling argument, how do you then back that up?
A lot of times with employee surveys, that's like a big piece of it. So, people could get a sentiment or a feeling, or there's rumors going around, but typically we don't really make decisions on that unless we have like survey data or things like that, or survey data, or we also have monthly manager one-on-ones with documentation. So if there's enough documentation in those manager conversations across the org, then that's another piece of data we have.
I love that. And I think most HR people would agree with you, right? Especially with something like an engagement survey, what's really great about that is that you get sort of a bird's eye view. You had sort of, you alluded to this earlier, which is, is it one person saying this or is it 20 people saying this? Am I over-indexing on something? Is it recency bias? And so being able to actually look at a complete data set is really important. And the reason I'm talking about this in the context of an anonymous reporting tool is because the reality is anonymous reporting tools are, of course, by their nature for reporting potential incidents. But the reality is a lot more comes in through these tools as well. Employees are giving feedback. Employees are sharing things that maybe don't quite breach a policy. And yet they're also really important because it could be indicative of a toxic work culture that's being created. It could be indicative of a leader on the team who is maybe towing the line of harassment, bullying behavior. We're not sure, right? And so I can just imagine, and Lori, let me know if this has ever come up on your end, or Melissa or anyone else on the call, where perhaps, you come to your CEO and you say, hey, there's a really senior executive team member on the team. I'm not seeing great stuff. I'm actually really concerned that this behavior is turning people away, is actually making people feel like we're in a toxic work environment, but then there's no data to back that up. Let me actually ask the question, Lori, have you ever encountered something like that?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a lot of relationship based, because it's like, do I just feel this? I don't want the CEO to think that I just feel this way about this individual, but I want it to see, you know what I mean? Or maybe me and that individual don't have a great relationship. So I don't want to look like I'm steering the ship there, but more of, hey, I do see this across the org. This is impacting teams.
100%. And also, let me throw out this disclaimer for anyone on the call who's participating in the comments, but maybe like nervous. The out I give everyone is your answers don't have to be specific to your current company. It could be any company you've ever been with. So it could be a previous leadership team where this came up. So I give you that out, Lori. I'm assuming that sometime in your tenure, this has come up. Could be any company.
Sure.
Thank you so much for sharing that with me. What we really want to focus on today with anonymous reporting is the full story, the full picture. We want to talk about incident reporting and the importance of that. We also want to talk about the culture impact. We also want to talk about how this empowers you to do your job better as a people professional. And we also want to talk about what that power what power it gives you to have all the information in one place. So we're going to cover these topics over the next hour or so. And Brandis and Ann are going to be super helpful in doing this. So thank you so much. Very, very excited to talk about how anonymous reporting can help you catch things you're not aware of, bring data to your leadership team, minimize legal risks, and ultimately create a safe and successful culture. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and kick it off. As is my favorite, we're going to do another pulse check question, and you know that I'm not lying. I will sit here awkwardly if no one answers. So I encourage you all to answer. All right. Okay. Next question. Scale of 1 to 5. Same concept. 5 being super agree or yes, 100%, and 1 not so much. How comfortable do you think your employees feel reporting an incident? And again, it could be this company or in a previous company, but if you think about your employees as a whole, how comfortable do you think they are reporting incidents across the company? 1 to 5. 5, very comfortable. 1, not comfortable at all.
And Melanie, I will say, having been through one of our polls, I'm definitely feeling better about the 7-second pause.
Yes. See, it comes in, just takes some time. I feel like I'm one of these people. I'm like, should I answer? Should I not? I'm not sure. All right, Melissa, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself. By the way, thank you so much. I'd love to have you tell me a little bit more about this. Why do you think that your employees are only a 2 at the I feel comfortable reporting an incident?
I'm just trying to make Anne not feel bad for
Love
waiting,
Thanks, Melissa.
you know. No, look, I think it always depends on the organization. I think an aspect of reporting is also, it depends probably on the stage of company, but I think also an aspect of do they feel comfortable with the people? Do they feel comfortable with the system? Do they feel comfortable that there's going to be acted upon, for whoever or whatever they're reporting to? And so, I think there's a bunch of different factors that play into sort of that level of comfort in terms of reporting. And so oftentimes, if they don't feel comfortable, it ends up being a letter from a lawyer after they leave.
Oh, tell me more about that. So because I love that you actually segued into that next section, which is, okay, I don't think they're that comfortable. And also like, here are the ramifications of that. Tell us some more. What do you mean when you say, if they're not going to share it in a reporting tool, it's going to come back later in the form of some sort of legal incident?
I think, look, it always comes out eventually, right? If somebody isn't happy in a meaningful way. And so, if you can't get it out, with your manager, if you can't get it out with HR, you can't get it out in the system, then, oftentimes it'll, whether the person is forced to leave, whether they leave on their own, it always does result in some letter, whether it's 1 month, whether it's immediate, whether it's 6 months after the fact, from a letter, from a lawyer, an EEOC complaint of this person felt uncomfortable, this is the result to the company, and something you eventually will have to deal with one way or the other. So you're better off, I think, being able to flush those things out sooner rather than later to get in front of it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a real risk. Brandis, I'm sure, is going to chat through that a little bit more in a second. Thank you so much for sharing, Melissa. And I think, from the people perspective as well, even if on the off chance, which I agree with you, the chance is very high, but on the off chance that someone doesn't then pursue legal action, you then have a culture that's slowly but surely getting worse because these things are bubbling up. No one's saying anything. So you're not catching these problems until it's too late. I think there's often a stereotype of HR as being reactive, or they're damage control, right? As opposed to being proactive and solving problems before they sort of spiral and snowball. And this is the kind of thing that can lead to that. It also leads to an erosion of trust. And to your point, accountability, right? This idea that, well, if I say anything, nothing's going to happen. So I'm just going to not say anything. So now I'm building this narrative in my head that there is an accountability at the company. People can just continue to, engage in poor behavior and no action will be taken. There are no repercussions. Brandis, I would love to hear a little bit more on the legal side of things, since that seems to be, pretty hot topic on the call today.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, you already gave the disclaimer, but I will give it one more time as a lawyer. I'm going to speak on legal topics, but I'm not giving legal advice. But I'm excited to share my perspective as a lawyer. I think one of the things, like when you're thinking about reporting, you have to think of the continuum of types of things that someone will report. I mean, a lot of people naturally go to incidents of discrimination or harassment, but it might be like overseeing potential like misuse of like company assets or fraud. There's like a variety, or like a data privacy issue. I think that there's like a lot of different things that could come in their reporting tool. And in reality, depending on like your role, what industry you're in, and what the specific incident is, you might actually have a legal obligation to specifically report. And so if you're putting through either through your policies or through the law or through some like forum, you have like an obligation to report, you really do want to like then create a set of tools that allows people to fulfill like their responsibilities under your code of conduct or your employee handbook. I think that if you don't allow that to like happen naturally, people like the same things might be going on, but you're just not going to know what those things are, which could, in the context of a data security incident, someone like accidentally clicks on a phishing link and like is embarrassed by it but doesn't want to tell, could expose the company to a lot of like reputational harm, or like takeover of company assets to like, real incidents of discrimination where, so-and-so has been harassing such one employee that is going unchecked. And then they start harassing a number of other employees. And it goes from one issue that you have to specifically deal with, which you obviously need to deal with, to something that's impacting like the broader culture and a number of different employees. And so I think like we have to know that like we provide expectations for employees as to what we want them to do. And then if there's not a way for them to like fulfill those obligations, you're kind of stuck knowing I have this piece of information, but I don't know what to do with it. Obviously, like in a lot of cultures, people feel comfortable bringing a variety of topics up, but there is like a number of people who would feel much more comfortable, at least initially, reporting the incident, particularly if there's a fear of retaliation anonymously, and just like giving some of the information to kick off like a deeper look into it. So I think that's when I'm thinking about it from a legal perspective, I think about the fact that like it doesn't, just because you don't have a way to report doesn't mean the obligation doesn't exist. And so if you make it really hard for people to do it, you're going to discourage it, and it's likely going to lead to like greater problems within your company.
I think it's a really great point to make, and one that probably not enough people think about, this idea that sort of like no news is good news, but actually that's not true, right? No news means you don't know what's happening, and it could be leading to really problematic things. I think more recently, for anyone who's not familiar or maybe familiar with, there was a McDonald's case recently that, explored exactly that. If I'm not aware of a situation, am I liable for this? And the answer was yes, it's your job as a company to be providing outlets and avenues for people to surface these sorts of issues, because they are happening. Or they might be happening even if no one is saying anything. And so if they're happening, you better do your best to make sure that you are finding out, or at least providing an avenue to then learn more about that. So with that said, I think it isn't super helpful to say, oh my gosh, these are all the detriments and the problems that can arise if you don't know what's going on. Let's actually talk about effective ways to help encourage employees to then speak up, understanding that, to Melissa's point, to Brandis's point, employees sometimes can struggle to speak up. So how do we make this an easier process for them? How do we make it more comfortable for them to say something and understand what next steps look like? And Anne, if you could give us a view of what that looks like and how we're doing that on the Athena reporting tool.
That would be my pleasure, Melanie. I am going to start screen sharing. And if you or Brandis could let me know when you can see our tool, I'll proceed from there. Okay, amazing. So obviously, as we've been discussing, it is extremely important to encourage reporting when you have something happening at your company that you might want to hear about. And throughout our research, one of the most consistent themes was that employees had a lot of questions about what might happen if they reported. They had a lot of concerns about what the process would look like if they reported. And so one of the things we wanted to do was orient employees and try to answer a bunch of their questions upfront. So when they go to report, they're first met with this page where we give them the opportunity to learn about some of the concerns they have and get some of their key questions answered. Really excitingly, we also provide an opportunity for companies and admins to configure how to answer some of these questions so that we can make sure that the expectations we are setting for their teams are aligned with their internal processes. So think something like, what is the investigation process like at your company? We'll use the sample with Athena. You can then put in your own language to help folks on your team understand what it looks like if an investigation gets kicked off. And again, this is all in service of making sure that someone who is thinking about reporting has something that you need to know, has as few barriers as possible between that need to know and you actually finding out.
I love that. And can I just say, when this was first demoed to me, I was obsessed, because I think those are exactly the questions that come up. And sometimes those questions present such big barriers that employees don't even feel comfortable asking those questions to a team member, because they want the answers before they even share that there's a thing that they might want to share. And so I really love that we have that information up front. People can discreetly, privately look at that information and then for themselves make a decision. And hopefully that decision is to share that thing. So thank you, Anne. All right, go ahead, Brandis.
One more thing to jump in there. In prior companies, I feel like the idea of like creating whistleblower or hotline solutions is seen as really big company, and it's anti-culture, and it seems like it's, it's like, putting an employee against the company. And I really think reporting is like, demonstrates like a healthy culture where people feel like comfortable speaking up and feel like it's safe. One of the things, obviously I'm biased, that I like about what Anne just showed is, like sometimes people will direct you to this like unknown 800 number of like that you've never heard about, and you're like, how am I supposed to report there? I think like having an interface and a solution that seems approachable to people is also important for like the reporting experience, because if you're like, dial this 800 number and you don't understand what you're doing, you might be like, why would I feel more comfortable going to this random 800 number of a vendor that I've like never heard of? Whereas like if you're introducing it in a way that seems approachable and safe, and it's maybe a vendor that you've otherwise interacted with, you might say, I've had a positive experience with there. I feel like if I report in that forum, it's actually going to be handled. And so I like the evolution of how we're thinking about reporting tools, not to some scary number where you don't know where it's going to go and it might never be responded to, versus like situations that facilitate like first invite you to feel comfortable reporting, and then you feel like it's going to be handled from start to finish.
Yeah, and Brandis, I will say our research absolutely backs that up. We found that this landing page where you get your questions answered is pretty critical for every employee, whether or not you're already using Athena training. But there is extra value for someone who is coming from a platform that they trust and know already, that they're using a tool that they know is effective, that they recognize, and is not just some unknown 1-800 number floating out in the abyss.
And we got a pretty interesting question that came in, actually. I think you'd be the best person to answer this. If you don't mind, I'll throw it your way. Can you tell us a little bit about the flexibility offered in terms of customizing these questions, FAQs, and also should companies be customizing these questions and FAQs?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is we do let you entirely customize the questions that are in your control. There are some things that we don't recommend or allow you to customize. So this is things like, how do you protect my identity? That is an Athena question. And we want to make sure that we are explaining to your teams how we handle that in the terms that we feel are clearest to them. But for things that are about your company, absolutely, you are encouraged to make that as specific and recognizable as possible to the folks on your team.
I will say what I love about our approach is even the sections that can and should be customized, we offer a default answer to start from. And I think this is so important because it's always easier to edit than to start from scratch. And also because just acknowledging the reality of most people teams, you're under-resourced, understaffed, takes a lot of work to do this all on your own. And so the fact that you have a platform and a tool that already sets everything up for you. And so if you needed to, you could just press a button and you're done, right? I think is very, very helpful for people who maybe have different needs and different bandwidth and, just different things that they are able to spend their time on. So yeah, I'm a big fan, biased, but All right, so I'm going to move on to the next section, which as always, I'm going to kick it off with a pulse check question. I want to talk a little bit about the lines of communication at a company, which is something that we've sort of been hinting at throughout these discussions, right? Making sure that your employees are speaking up and sharing things with you, but also feeling like you have that sense of connection with them, building that culture. So the question I'd like to pose to everyone, and this one's easier, it's yes or no, okay? You don't have to pick a number, but yes or no, who here has ever gotten anonymous feedback that you couldn't directly respond to? And this could be, maybe you've set up your own free hotline at your company through a Google form, and it's anonymous, or it could be that you've set up an anonymous engagement survey or DEI survey or something like that. Yes or no, who here has ever gotten anonymous feedback that you couldn't respond to? Okay. Oh, we have some contradictions on the call. I love it. All right, Lori, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself, tell me a little bit about the context of the anonymous feedback. You don't have to give me the feedback itself, but the context. Was it an engagement survey, a hotline, something else, an anonymous, report of some sort, where maybe somebody was telling you something on someone else's behalf? And I'll pause there. Tell me a little bit more about the context.
I would say two. One, definitely the employee engagement survey. When those come through, they're anonymous. And so I can see things that people respond to and maybe I can see it was more of a miscommunication. But I don't know who said it and I don't know how to kind of clear the air for that person. And then also just through, I meet usually like twice a year. I have one-on-ones with managers. So kind of things that there was an instance where, a seller, we'll say it's a last company, a seller thought that two employees, she felt like she was being discriminated against as a female seller. And she felt like in the past, when another seller quit, that he complained about two other employees and that they were then fired because he complained. But she's making complaints about employees and they're not fired. Well, they weren't fired. They weren't, that wasn't the instance. You know what I mean? She just kind of had it all wrong, but there was really nothing I could do about it because it was just like hearsay and it was never through a formal channel.
Those are both incredibly interesting to me. And I'd love to ask the follow-up question, which is, especially the second one, but also that first one where you highlight, it's a miscommunication. How does that feel? How does it feel to get feedback that you have enough context to know, oh, this is, someone's missing a piece of information, but then you can't actually respond? What goes through your mind?
I always feel kind of like I'm letting them down. I'm like, oh no, that's not what it was. And now, I feel a little bit worried, like, oh, they're getting that wrong. And I don't know who that was. I hope it wasn't someone that I'm really, that's an impactful employee, but they have that wrong. And I don't know how to make that right now.
Yep, I can identify entirely. This has absolutely come up on my end as a people professional. It feels really painful because, to your point, you feel like you're letting the person down. You feel like probably more, if one person is misunderstanding this, maybe other people are misunderstanding this. You can't ask follow-up questions to learn, how could I have done a better job of communicating the situation? And also, on top of all of that, there's also this sense that, ooh, do they think that I don't care because I'm not responding, even though it's because I can't respond? So if I'm not taking big public action, do they think I'm just ignoring them and I didn't take this seriously? I'm going to share a quick anecdote because I shared this with Brandis and Anne yesterday and their eyes went like this. So at my last company, we had an anonymous hotline that we did through Google Forms, which I think many people do, right? It's a free version. You can do the anonymous thing. And so it feels like it gets the job done. And so we had an anonymous hotline. And I think as is typical, many people, some people use it to report actual incidents. And some people will use it just to share feedback. And that's okay, right? Because at least you're collecting information. They're surfacing things that are valuable for you to know. And because we did not want people to feel that we were ignoring them, we would selectively respond to some of them publicly at town halls, right? Obviously, we were very careful about, which ones we chose. We wanted to be mindful of people's privacy and any legal issues and stuff like that. But we would say like, okay, here are a couple of things that came in, and at town hall, we'd just talk about it. And what we found was that, I think, as will come to no surprise to anyone on the call, what we found was then, of course, you start to build this skewed picture where, I think, Lori, it was you that said this earlier, right? Is it one person or is it 20? When you then respond in the only way that you can, which is in a public forum, it can then feel like, oh, is this a widespread issue? How many people ask this question? How often does this question come up? When really it was one person who maybe had a misunderstanding, but you don't know, right? Because it's really hard and it's anonymous and you're doing your best to respond. So then you respond to the whole company and now you get them all thinking about this thing, right? And so it's really tough when you get anonymous feedback, but then you can't respond. And the thing is, I want to flag that doesn't mean that we should throw away anonymous feedback. We still want it. It's still valuable. The reality is that for many reasons, someone might not feel comfortable sharing feedback anonymously. Maybe the company has a psychological safety issue. Maybe the company hasn't built a culture of feedback yet where they've educated and trained and provided the support needed for people to give that feedback with their name to it, right? Or maybe there are other things at play. Maybe there's a power dynamic that's making someone nervous. Maybe there's a gender or racial dynamic or intersectional dynamics that are at play, right? And so at the end of the day, I'm certainly not saying that we should get rid of anonymous feedback. And in fact, I'd actually love to pass the baton to Brandis real quick, because I know that there are also legal reasons why it's important to allow people an anonymous forum through which to provide feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the like key reasons why, I mean, so first of all, when, as you just mentioned, like an anonymous reporting tool should be one of the tools in your toolkit. Like it would be, it would be counterproductive to do everything anonymously within your business, because that would not be sustainable. But like creating a forum, and I think one of the key drivers in like why this is a requirement under like various like laws is that it serves as like a protection against retaliation. I mean, I think a lot of reasons people won't bring things forward is because they're fearful that their employer can retaliate. And while there is so much law in place that makes it very clear that an employer can't retaliate against an employee for engaging in a protected activity, like filing in good faith these types of reports, the reality is like retaliation does happen. And it's not just that someone's terminated. It might be that they're demoted. It might be that they get an unjustified poor performance review. There's many different like variations of retaliation. And so creating a forum in which people can report without that fear of retaliation is critically important if you want people to surface. Like think of a situation where your manager is the perpetrator of like some specific type of misconduct. You don't want to tell them because they're the specific person involved. Where are you going to go? And so that would be an obvious case where you would be fearful by bringing it up or even going around them to someone else, that there'd be like adverse action that came to you. And so that's why this is important. I think that like, in doing like some research on anonymous reporting, I think that there's often a fear that it will just like lead to a number of like false or defamatory claims. Like if you create an anonymous forum, people are just going to lie, send a bunch of like false rumors and just like make stuff up because they like, similar to like some of the online activities where people like act as a different persona of themselves. Like people think that an anonymous reporting tool will like lead to like false reports, but that's like really not backed up by evidence that like companies that offer these tools get a number of false reports. And so I think like, again, creating a forum where someone who might have a fear of retaliation can like safely report without like immediately like being prohibited by this fear is really important. I'll note, it's really interesting because I know top of mind for companies that are operating in the EU with the EU whistleblower directive is like standing up a tool, and finding a confidential or anonymous tool has been like a key consideration. I will note, interestingly enough, there are still countries and local laws that prohibit anonymous reporting or severely restrict it. And so I think digging in and looking at some of the reasons why those countries don't and how they've like evolved with the EU whistleblowers directive is really interesting. But one thing that's always to keep in mind is like if you're deploying an anonymous solution, in various like countries, is always like make sure that you're looking at local law to ensure that what you're offering complies with the local requirements there. So that's just like an asterisk that I wanted to add on.
I'm really fascinated by what you said about this idea that, there tends to be a fear that allowing anonymous reporting will lead to widespread false claims. And I'm just gonna own it and say that, yeah, as a people professional, I think many of us have been conditioned and trained as, risk mitigators. And so I do think oftentimes our mind goes to what is the worst possible situation and how do I create a policy and a culture that does not allow those things. And we say that in a lot of different forums, right? It doesn't have to be anonymous reporting. It could be, how you construct your PTO policy, for example, how you construct your sick time policy, how you construct your performance standards, right? You're building it around the underperformers or the occasional, person who abuses the policy, as opposed to building it on good faith and for the majority and all of that. And I think it's a really powerful statement for you to make, to say, especially to, I think, a field that admittedly, as a part of this field, is used to really focusing on the worst case scenario, to really just put it out there and say, actually, this is not that common. It's very unlikely for this to happen. This is not the outcome of allowing anonymous feedback. With that said, I think, we've sort of made the case for You got to allow anonymous feedback unless you're working out of a country where that's not allowed legally. And also, I don't think that we've addressed the reality that it's really hard then to get anonymous feedback that you can't respond to. And so what's really cool about thinking about, signing on with a vendor that focuses and specializes on anonymous reporting is, I want to acknowledge the reality that for many companies, you will go with a Google form because it's free, it's easy, you can set it up in 2 seconds, and yet you run into that issue that we've been talking about. The reality is a vendor that specializes in this actually removes that barrier. So you can still have someone report something anonymously, and that doesn't mean you can't respond to them. You actually can speak to someone anonymously and have back and forth extended conversations with them. And so with that said, I actually, especially for anyone who's maybe never heard of something like this, Anne, I'd love to throw it over to you so you can show exactly what this looks like in practice.
My pleasure, Melanie. And again, I will ask for some visual confirmation when you all can see our demo. Okay, excellent. So I promise we will return to the screen that is a little bit grayed out behind the pop-up window later. So know that we will look over there. But the basic story here is that if you are using Athena's anonymous reporting tool, you can open basically the case file for a report that has been made, and you have the option to contact the reporter. That will pop up a form like this, where you can then send a note or send follow-up questions to the person who has reported. A note could be used for communication where you just need to inform them of something. That could be a quick thank you that the report was received and that you're investigating, and they may hear more. And the question feature is to solve the problem that Lori and Melanie both talked about, which is this: I've gotten something important, I want to take action, I don't have the information that I have to move forward. And so in that case, you can type out a question, even to someone who's anonymous, and the platform will allow for bidirectional communication between the person who reported, even if they didn't disclose their name, and you. As for what this looks like for the person who reported, they will get an email that looks something like this. Right here where it says admin name, that would be the name of the person who actually sent that question over to them, so they know there's a person on the other side. They click view questions and this button in their email, and that will then bring them back into the portal. Excuse me, I can click through just like this, and they can respond to the questions you have. So that means that you will not hit that frustrating wall where someone has reported something you want to look into, but you don't have all the information that you need to move forward. And again, if all you want to do is let someone know that there's a thank you or clear something up without asking them anything, this same flow will get used. And when your employee gets to this page, they will instead just see a note instead of a note with a question box.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to be honest. At my previous company, we used Google form as was evidenced by my example, and this would have been amazing. This would have helped wildly, so that we could have direct conversations, so we could not, mislead people in terms of how widespread a situation was, and so that for the incidents or for the reports where we couldn't actually publicly respond, make sure that person knows that we're paying attention, that we care, that we are holding ourselves accountable, that we want to learn more and support them in this in the information that they've shared. With that said, we're going to kick it over to our last section, which is, talking about the importance of data tracking and having everything in one place and making sure that you're up to date on everything that's happened and being able to easily track that information over time. So last time, I promise, this last one, I'm going to ask one more pulse check question. It's another yes, no, so super easy. Yes, no. Who here has ever stepped in to help manage a situation, only to realize that you were missing context around a previous incident, maybe previous patterns of reports or other people that had, talked about similar behavior in the past? Who here's ever walked into a situation, an HRBP situation, and realized, oh boy, there's a whole lot of context that I don't have here? Okay, seems like we have a yes. I would have been really surprised if we had, oh, Lori, I'm going to call on you in a second because I need to know more about your no. But in the meantime, Melissa, tell me a little bit more about why you answered yes here. Oh, it looks like you unmuted and then muted again, so I'm
Oh,
flagging.
sorry.
I know, go ahead.
I was gonna say, in any startup ecosystem, I think, so much of the, especially when you're building the HR function, so many of the notes are kind of, in Google Docs, or one HR person is only there and they're not really transferred over. You're just sort of building out, what does that organizational structure look like? So, and what does the legal file structure look like, right? For the employee files. So you just don't always have all of that in a neat, clean place. And if you don't have the reporting structure, right, in one neat, clean place, it's just the stuff is all over the place. So you might be missing, there might be a report that came in LinkedIn, there might be a report that came in Google, an email, there might be, a complaint that came through, the performance review system, right? So just putting that all together in one place to make sure you have the whole package, to make sure you understand what's happening before decisions are made. It's, it can be complex, especially when you're moving fast.
I think that's exactly right. And, what comes to mind for me in particular is when you come in as the new HRBP, or when you come in and, you're switching things up. So, this manager has transitioned teams. So now you've lost that information because the other HRBP is the one who's sitting with that information. And to your point, you can document that in Google Docs, for example, but who then makes sure that that information gets transferred to the next person and it's easily accessible? And how do I even know that I should be looking? And where do I look to find this specific information? And it can get quite out of hand. I've personally definitely experienced this myself, where it's sort of like, wait, this happened before. Oh, that HRBP doesn't work here anymore. How do we?
Yeah, or it's in somebody's email, right? Like,
yeah,
yeah.
100%, right? And I think in the moment it can feel like, oh, it's obvious, it's documented, it's in an email, or it's in that Slack. And then you realize, oh no, that email account got deactivated, or, Slack messages expire after, X number of months, right? And, it's a lot of work, I think, to manually then transfer that into a doc that then is shared with, who do we share it with? I don't even know who to give this access to. Lori, before I move on, I'm actually just genuinely curious, because you said no, that this has never happened to you. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you avoid this kind of situation? I've never heard someone say that they've never walked into something like that.
I mean, I don't want to say nothing slipped through the cracks, but I came on in a startup culture and I stood up our HR department from the ground. So it's like, I've been there since employee 15. We're still small. So I still hear a lot. We're at 53 now. And it's like, I'm pretty close to the ground, everything. And I stood up all those systems. So I'd say the only time I do lose track is like when things are verbally and then not documented by managers is probably my only spot, but typically I'm pretty in the know.
I think that's a really great point to make. You're right. If you stood up the HR department and you're still small enough and everything filters through you, yeah, you're not going to miss much. What I'm curious about is the next person that comes in, right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
I've done my best to set them up for success. But they would, I'm sure. I've even seen instances where new managers come on and then they don't have all the context behind the relationships or the decisions or things like that. And they're kind of like, can you help me explain like what's the deal here? So
here's the thing, I really want to acknowledge something you said, which is I'm doing my best. And here's the thing, especially if you're at a smaller company, especially if you're the only HR person, especially if you're the one who stood everything up, your best is also happening amongst all these other responsibilities that are pulling you in different directions. And I'm sure your best is quite good. And also inevitably, right, something's going to slip. Inevitably, it's going to be, a little bit harder to then catch up the next person.
Sure.
Brandis and I, who work very closely together, sometimes we have to struggle with this as well, which is like, where are we documenting everything to make sure that we're both in the loop, or make sure that anybody in the future is then going to have that information. And so, yeah, it's documentation is super important. Having to manually make sure you're tracking everything and doing all that, it can get quite cumbersome and time consuming, which, especially if you're a team of one or a team of two, is maybe not the best use of your time. And so with that said, spoiler alert, in a second, we're going to talk about how Athena's product can help with that. But I'd actually love to throw it over to Brandis first with the segue of, obviously it's really important that we have all the information, because not only from an HR perspective does it make it harder for you to then help that person, right? If you imagine, the new person coming in and then you having to get them up to speed, and now you're losing time, they're losing time, right? But also there are legal risks that come into play when you don't have all the information and you're tackling an issue, right? Maybe you think it's the first time something has happened and you're like, oh, it's not a pattern of behavior. Let's just let it go, right? Brandis, can you tell us a little bit more about the legal risk that can come into play when you don't have a centralized place to track all the data that's happening, especially around something like incident reports?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll start by saying that what Lori said really resonated. In like a prior iteration, I was an early employee. I filled out a lot of like fundraising diligence requests or like otherwise like documented information, and then I left. And I routinely think to this day, like, how do they have additional context? When we had to talk live in a fundraising context about various incidents, like I could just say things off the top of my head. And to your point, like I did my best, but there's like just something about being there live versus like, how do you make sure that information transfers over? I think that's like one of the key things is like questions around incidents within your company come up in so many different forums. Like from like obviously like litigation, if things like turn, or investigations, but also in like more mundane things, like if you're doing a fundraise and you have to identify certain things that happen, you need to be able to catalog and, make certain representations about what's happened within. And if you don't have an easy way to have like centralized tracking of that information, you might be, providing incomplete information, which could be problematic. I think, Melanie, you referenced the McDonald's decision earlier. I also think, if you're, in leadership and you're stepping into these roles, like there's even greater like scrutiny now on your ability to know what's going on within a company. And, as an organization grows and you can't personally manage things, you have to rely on a central place where you'll be able to gather the information, because you have personal liability if a number of things are going on within the company and you're not like, fulfilling your like oversight duty. And so like in the McDonald's decision, the chief people officer, like, was found to not be fulfilling his like oversight duty and did not put in place the right mechanisms to be able to like track the types of misconduct that were happening within. And so not only can it like, as a lawyer impede your ability to do your job, but like, if you're in a leadership position within a company, you might be held like personally like liable for your failure to know the going ons within your company. And so having like a tracking mechanism that you can refer to, that is going to be complete, that is going to be robust, is really important. One more thing, and I'll turn it back for Anne to dive in, but in the last section when we were talking about the need for communication, I feel like a lot of times when people first initially report things, they do one of two things. Either they're really brief and they say like this happened, but they don't give enough context for you to really understand, or they like say I was discriminated against. And like if someone just says I was discriminated against and you don't know more, that's like that like gives me heartburn as a lawyer, because I'm like, are you just describing it as discrimination, or was it actually discrimination? Do I now have to report it because you've like self-diagnosed it as that? And so I think, again, having like robust data tracking abilities with like bi-directional information that you were able to gather that creates a complete file is just really going to serve you, because not only will you be left with like pieces of information that you don't really know what to do with, but you'll have like a fulsome record that you and people who come after you will be able to look to understand the true risk within the company.
Sometimes hearing you talk, Brandis, really scares me. I'm like, oh my goodness, there is so much risk everywhere you turn. But I think it's so important, right, that people know that these are real risks. These are things that could happen. We like to work in, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And so the reality is that, unfortunately, legal risk is everywhere. And, the possibility for litigation could come up. And when it does one day, you do want to be super prepared. So thank you, Brandis. Anna, I would love to turn it over to you to help show us what it looks like to organize everything in one place. And I'd love if you could to emphasize, to Brandis's point, the fact that, feedback can come from many different places. And I think Melissa also referenced this, what if it's not the person who it happened to that wants to share this or who is reporting it to? What if it's the manager who heard about this from their direct report? How then do we track everything all in one place and make that, a more seamless experience?
Melanie, I'd be happy to address all of that. And I'll actually start with where you ended, sort of how information gets in from disparate sources, and then we can talk about the records themselves. So we already looked at what the flow is like for an employee to report sort of their own experience. They get to that wonderful landing page with all of the questions and concerns that they have addressed up front. We have that same flow open for managers. So I'll show you what that looks like. If you are in the incident disclosure experience, you can actually note that you're reporting on behalf of someone else. And this is something I actually should say we expect most commonly managers to use, because that is one of the main avenues that employees will use for reporting is their own manager, but it can be someone else's manager, it can be a peer. This is also a system through which someone can log something that they heard about, even if it didn't happen to them, and it flows into the same centralized place. And on that note, if you are, say, an HR partner and you have a disclosure made to you in a one-on-one, you have this create report flow that allows you to log an incident within the system, even if no one ever went through that flow in the first place, so that to use Brandis's legal language, you can have this complete and fulsome record of everything that happened and really refer back to that as needed over time. As for what sorts of information we record, we really do want everything. And Melanie, this touches on your point, to be part of a single record. So we can take a look at a sample record. You have information about when things were filed. You have a record of all of the back and forth communication that happened. You have any notes that you decide to take throughout the investigation or process of learning more about the report. Again, all stored in one centralized place. You can also add and change statuses. You can add and change owners so that you minimize the chance as things are moving forward, if anything's slipping or getting missed, and have the ability to spot trends over time. So things like, are we seeing lots of reporting around discrimination or around security incidents, et cetera. But again, this all just supports the idea that you have a trustworthy central place where all of this information that it's really critical not to lose track of lives, and it can get there through a variety of input methods.
Again, if my past self had a tool like this, boy, would my life have been easier.